the 7th of December, 1941, 7:02 a.m., Hawaii time. At the Opana radar station on the northern tip of Oahu, two young American privates, Lockard and Elliott, were staring blankly at the green circular screen in front of them. It was a Sunday. By regulation, the radar station was supposed to shut down at 7 a.m. sharp, and they should have been heading to breakfast. But because the breakfast truck was late, the two decided to leave the machine running a little longer to get in some extra practice. That's when something strange appeared on the screen. Usually, a plane would appear on radar as a tiny blip. But this time, a large, fuzzy blob of light appeared on the screen, moving slowly and steadily toward the south. Lockard had never seen anything like it. He thought the machine was broken, or maybe a bug had crawled into the oscilloscope. After checking and rechecking, they came to a conclusion. It was a group of planes, and not just a few, dozens, maybe even over 100. Distance, 132 miles. Direction, due north. The two immediately grabbed the phone and called the information center at Pearl Harbor. The man who answered was a lieutenant named Tyler. Remember this name, because in the next few seconds, he was about to speak one of the most expensive sentences in military history. Lieutenant Tyler listened to the report and checked his watch. He remembered the briefing from the night before, mentioned a flight of B-17 bombers flying in from the mainland that morning. So, in a casual, sleepy voice, he told the two nervous soldiers, "Don't worry about it." The phone clicked off. The two soldiers shut down the radar and went down the hill for breakfast. Pearl Harbor remained immersed in the laziness of a Sunday morning. Church bells were getting ready to ring, sailors were lining up on deck to raise the flag, and the military band was picking up their instruments. No one knew that just above the clouds, only a few thousand meters up, death had already unlocked the safety catch. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leader of the Japanese air attack, pulled back his canopy. He looked down at the massive harbor below, arranged neatly like toy blocks. Even in his dreams, he never imagined it would be this smooth. No anti-aircraft fire, no fighter interceptors. The entire Pacific Fleet was sitting there like a turkey served on a platter. At 7:53 a.m., Fuchida pressed the radio button and sent out the famous code to the entire attack force and to the Imperial headquarters thousands of kilometers away. Tora, Tora, Tora. Translated, it means tiger, tiger, tiger. It meant surprise attack successful. But in the rearview mirror of history, those three syllables sound more like a death knell. This wasn't just an air raid. This was the biggest all-in gamble in human history. An island nation starved of resources, in order to prolong its fantasy of hegemony, had bet its entire national destiny on these short 90 minutes. They thought they were waking up to victory. In reality, they had just finished digging a massive grave for their own empire. Chapter 1. The Countdown to Death Oil, Embargo, and the Forced Gambler. To understand why the Japanese would commit such suicidal folly, we can't just look at the tactics of that day. We have to look at how much money they had left in their pockets. Or, more accurately, how much oil. Rewind to the summer of 1941. Japan was like a thug speeding down the highway, only to suddenly realize the low fuel light was on. Because of the invasion of China and the occupation of French Indochina, the United States imposed the harshest sanction on Japan, an oil embargo. For Japan, this was fatal. At the time, Japan relied on the U.S. for 80% of its oil imports. Without oil, those battleships showing off in the Pacific were just piles of scrap metal. Without oil, those Zero fighters were just expensive aluminum models. The Naval General Staff made a top-secret calculation. If they didn't find a solution, Japan's oil reserves would only last 18 months. After 18 months, the entire Japanese empire would be paralyzed by a lack of fuel and die without firing a shot. There were only two paths before them. Path 1, submit, withdraw troops from China, bow to the U.S., and trade for oil. To the militarists, this was a fate worse than death. Absolutely unacceptable. Path 2, robbery. Go south to Southeast Asia, seize the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, where there was inexhaustible oil. But to go south, Their flank would be completely exposed to the muzzle of U.S. bases in the Philippines and the Pacific Fleet. Thus, a mad logic was born. Since we must steal oil, we must first fight the U.S. Since we can't beat the U.S. in a long-term industrial war of attrition, we must knock the Americans out in the opening instant, hit them so hard they don't dare fight back. The man who devised this plan was the very man who least wanted to fight the U.S. Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was an anomaly. He wasn't a country bumpkin officer who only knew how to shout banzai. He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in the U.S. He had seen the automotive assembly lines of Detroit and the smoke-belching steel mills of Pittsburgh with his own eyes. He knew better than anyone that the gap between Japan's industrial strength and America's was the difference between an infant and a giant. When Prime Minister Konoe asked him, "If we go to war with the U.S., what are your chances?" Yamamoto spoke those famous words, filled with a gambler's fatalism. "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year. Do you understand?" Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor plan was fundamentally not a plan for victory, but a plan for extortion. He wanted to use an unprecedented massive sneak attack to wipe out the main force of the U.S. Pacific Fleet overnight. Then, exploiting the Americans' imagined weakness of being afraid to die, force the U.S. to the negotiating table to recognize Japan's hegemony in Asia. This is typical gangster logic. I stab you in the street first until you are bleeding profusely, and then ask you, "Do you want to bleed to death? Or give me your wallet and get lost." Yamamoto thought the Americans would hand over the wallet, but he made a fatal mistake. He understood American factories, he understood American warships, but he didn't understand the American temper. He thought he was making a deal with a rational businessman. He didn't know that when you treacherously stab a cowboy in the back, he will never negotiate with you. He will pay any price, chase you to the ends of hell, just to twist your head off. On this morning destined for bloodshed, Yamamoto held this revolver with only one bullet, aimed it at the sleeping giant, and pulled the trigger. Chapter 2. Mission Impossible, Shallow Water, Torpedoes, and the Silent Fleet. If attacking Pearl Harbor was a mad gamble, then winning that hand at Pearl Harbor seemed, at the time, to be a mission that defied physics. The reason the Americans dared to park their entire Pacific Fleet like private cars, neatly aligned in Pearl Harbor, was because they believed in a natural talisman: water depth. Pearl Harbor is a shallow port with an average depth of only 12 meters, about 40 feet. Aerial torpedoes of that time, when dropped from a plane, would dive like an athlete, plunging 20 or even 30 meters deep before surfacing to correct their course toward the target. Mathematically, this was unsolvable. If a torpedo needs a 30-meter buffer and the water is only 12 meters deep, dropping a torpedo would result in only one outcome: it would bury itself straight into the mud of the harbor floor, becoming an expensive iron stick. So, the U.S. top brass swore that Pearl Harbor was a natural torpedo-free zone. They didn't even bother to install anti-torpedo nets, thinking it was a waste of time. But they underestimated the Japanese engineers' almost obsessive ability to innovate. To solve this deadly puzzle, Japanese naval technicians led by staff officers like Minoru Genda conducted a series of top-secret experiments. In the end, the inspiration came from a Japanese child's toy. They attached a special wooden board to the tail of the torpedo. Yes, you heard that right, simple wooden boards. This board acted like a pair of air wings for the torpedo. It kept the torpedo horizontal before it hit the water, increasing air resistance, turning a high dive into a belly flop. Once it hit the water, the impact would shatter the wood, and the torpedo could maintain its course in extremely shallow water, even just 10 meters deep, heading straight for the vulnerable underbellies of the U.S. battleships. These specially made shallow water torpedoes were the Grim Reaper's scythe, custom-made for Pearl Harbor. Weapon problem solved. Now, how to deliver it? This massive fleet, known as the Kido Butai Mobile Force, including 6 aircraft carriers and 30 warships, had to cross 3,500 nautical miles of the North Pacific without being detected by anyone. In today's satellite era, this is impossible, but back then, it required extreme discipline. The fleet chose the northern route, where sea conditions were the worst at that time of year. Giant waves, almost no merchant ships. Yamamoto issued a death order, absolute radio silence. Even if ships collided in the storm, even if a man fell overboard, no radio signals, no stopping, no rescue. For the sake of that moment of surprise, any individual life was an expendable consumable. And so, this ghost fleet sailed the vast ocean for 12 days. In the rocking cabins, pilots stared at maps of Pearl Harbor until every berth, every oil tank was etched into their brains. Dawn, December 7. The fleet arrived at the attack position. The sea was eerily calm. The pilots drank their last cup of sake and tied on headbands that read "Certain Victory." In that moment, they felt like samurai about to die for their god. But from the height of history, they looked more like a group of arsonists about to light the fuse of their own house. Chapter 3. Bloody Sunday, the slaughter of Battleship Row. The 7th of December, 1941, 7:55 a.m. Pearl Harbor, Ford Island Naval Air Station. It was a perfect Sunday morning, sunny with a gentle breeze. On the deck of the battleship USS Nevada, the military band was lined up, the baton raised. They began to play the Star-Spangled Banner. Sailors stood at attention and saluted as the flag rose slowly. Just halfway through the anthem, a dark green plane roared past at low altitude. A musician on the rear deck looked up, probably muttering, "These Army pilots are crazy, running drills on a Sunday and flying so low." Then, that plane dropped something dark. A loud bang. A hangar in the distance exploded. The musician froze. The baton stopped in midair. Then, the second and third planes dived down. This time, even the dullest person could see it clearly, the bright red rising sun insignia on the wings. "This is not a drill. This is not a drill." The screaming voice came over the PA system, but it was already too late. On the famous Battleship Row, the U.S. Pacific Fleet's pride, 8 battleships, were moored. At this moment, they became the world's largest, most expensive targets. No anti-aircraft fire, because the ammunition boxes were locked in the storeroom, the keys were in the quartermaster's pocket, and the quartermaster was still sleeping on shore. No fighter interception, because to prevent sabotage, the U.S. had lined up their planes neatly in the middle of the runway, wingtip to wingtip, convenient for guards to patrol, and even more convenient for Japanese bombers to destroy in one go. At 8:06 a.m., the peak of the tragedy arrived. A Japanese horizontal bomber flew directly over the battleship USS Arizona. Bombardier Matsumura Harada looked through his sight and released the hook. An 800-kilogram armor-piercing bomb, modified from a battleship shell, fell with the scream of death. The bomb drilled precisely between the Arizona's number 1 and 2 turrets, pierced the deck, and burrowed into the forward magazine below. Hundreds of tons of black powder and shells were stored there. Boom! An earth-shattering explosion. The entire 30,000-ton battleship was physically lifted out of the water by the massive shockwave. A gigantic fireball rose into the sky, even engulfing a Japanese plane flying hundreds of meters above. In that instant, 1,177 American sailors on the Arizona were vaporized by temperatures of thousands of degrees before they could even feel pain. This wasn't just the sinking of a ship, it was the darkest moment in U.S. naval history. The entire Pearl Harbor turned into a pot of boiling oil. Burning heavy fuel floated on the surface, turning the sea into an inferno. Sailors jumping for their lives struggled and screamed in the fire. Meanwhile, in the sky, the Japanese pilots felt an almost absurd sense of ease. It was too easy. As easy as shooting ducks in a carnival game. They even had time to joke on the radio, boasting about their scores. In less than 30 minutes, the main force of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the steel wall thought to be invincible, turned into a pile of burning scrap metal in the mud. On that morning, the old era ended. Those battleships, symbols of the doctrine of big guns, lay in the harbor mud, announcing the arrival of the aircraft carrier age. The Japanese used the cruelest method to give the Americans a public lesson on modern naval warfare. The tuition fee, however, was far too expensive. Chapter 4. The Fatal Mistake. Chuichi Nagumo's Peasant Mentality. Around 10 a.m., the first two waves of attacks were over. Pearl Harbor was billowing with thick smoke, the sea covered with thousands of bodies and shattered ship planks. Japanese planes were returning to their carriers. At this moment, on the bridge of the flagship Akagi, a fierce debate erupted that would determine the course of the Pacific War for the next 4 years. Flight Commander Mitsuo Fuchida had just landed. His face covered in oil, he rushed to the bridge and pleaded with Fleet Commander Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. He strongly demanded, launch the third wave immediately. Fuchida knew very well that although the U.S. battleships were sunk, two of the most valuable targets in Pearl Harbor were untouched. First, the Navy Yard and dry docks. Those were for repairing ships. Second, and most importantly, the hundreds of massive oil tanks on the shores of Pearl Harbor. Stored, there were 4.5 million barrels of heavy oil. What does that mean? It was equivalent to the entire blood supply of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific at that time. If those tanks were bombed, Pearl Harbor would become a dead port. Without oil, the remaining U.S. ships couldn't move. Without dry docks, damaged ships couldn't be repaired. The U.S. would be forced to retreat its Pacific Fleet base 3,500 kilometers back to California on the West Coast. This would mean that for at least the next 2 years, the U.S. Navy could not show its face in the Western Pacific. This was the strategic result Yamamoto Isoroku wanted most. But Chuichi Nagumo, standing on the bridge, hesitated. Nagumo was a typical old-school Japanese naval officer, cautious, risk-averse, like an old peasant guarding his small plot of land. He calculated like this. First, we have achieved an unprecedented victory, sinking so many battleships. The mission is overfulfilled. Second, we still haven't found where the 3 U.S. aircraft carriers are. What if I send planes to bomb the oil tanks now, and the U.S. carriers suddenly jump out and attack my fleet? Third, quit while you're ahead. I won't be greedy. I need to bring this precious fleet back to Japan intact. This is a typical thief's mentality. I stole the wallet. Now I just want to run, not stay and burn the house down. So, Nagumo ignored Fuchida's angry glare and issued the order. All ships turn around, retreat north, return home. This decision saved America's life. Admiral Nimitz, who later took command of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, breathed a long sigh of relief when he saw the intact oil tanks and dry docks. He said, if the Japanese had bombed that oil, the war would have been prolonged for at least 2 years. Nagumo won a perfect score in tactics, but lost all his chips in strategy. He shattered the Americans' bones, but left behind the scalpel that would allow them to resurrect. Chapter 5. The Giant Awakens, the Revived Monster of Vengeance. Cut to Washington. The afternoon of the 7th of December, 1941. For Japan, the greatest tragedy of this day wasn't Nagumo's retreat, but the declaration of war that was supposed to be delivered with dignity. According to Yamamoto's script, the Japanese ambassador to the U.S. was supposed to hand the severance note to the U.S. Secretary of State 30 minutes before the attack began. That way, Japan could claim, "Look, I declared war before I hit you. I am a knight with honor." But an absurd scene unfolded. Because the typist at the Japanese embassy was too unskilled and typed too slowly, combined with the time needed for decoding and translation, this crucial document was exactly 55 minutes late. When Japanese Ambassador Nomura finally handed the document to U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Pearl Harbor was already a sea of fire. Hull looked at the 2 Japanese diplomats, shaking with rage. He pointed to the door and shouted the harshest words in diplomatic history. In all my 50 years of public service, I have never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions. Get out. In this moment, the nature of the event changed. What was designed as a knight's duel became a despicable sneak attack. This thoroughly enraged the Americans. Before this, the U.S. was filled with serious isolationist sentiment. Many Americans felt that wars in Europe or Asia were none of their business. They just wanted to live their lives. But the bombs at Pearl Harbor blew that isolationism to smithereens. The next day, President Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech to Congress. When he struggled to stand up from his wheelchair and uttered the words, "A date which will live in infamy," the applause and roars from the Congress Hall almost lifted the roof. The thing Yamamoto feared most had happened. He wanted to hurt America, but he woke up a monster. Overnight, long lines formed at U.S. recruitment stations. Detroit car factories stopped making sedans and converted to tank workshops. Boeing factories began running 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, printing bombers like newspapers. Even housewives donated their pots and pans to be melted down for steel. Japan didn't wake up an army. They woke up an industrial leviathan. This enraged giant would, in the following 3 years, use a flood of steel to grind the Japanese empire into dust. At the end of the story, let us return to the retreating Japanese flagship. While the staff officers around him popped champagne to celebrate the victory, it is said that Yamamoto stood alone on the deck, staring at the vast ocean, expressionless. Did he win? No, he lost. From the moment the first bomb fell, he had lost. He had personally started a countdown, and the end of that countdown was not in Washington, but 4 years later in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the story of Pearl Harbor, a carefully calculated suicide, a gambler's fable about winning the opening hand, only to lose everything.